The Dawnbreakers, Neville's narrative, recorded for the handicapped, tape 9. The army was ordered to set up a number of barricades in front of the fort, and to open fire upon anyone who chanced to leave its gate. Qurus forbade his companions to go out in order to fetch water from the neighborhood. "Our bread has been intercepted by our enemy," complained Rasul-i-Bani Miri. "What shall befall us if water should likewise be denied us?" Qurus, who was at that time, the hour of sunset, viewing the army of the enemy in company with Mullah Hussein from the terrace of the fort, turned to him and said, "The scarcity of water has distressed our companions. God willing, this very night a downpour of rain will overtake our opponents, followed by a heavy snowfall, which will assist us to repulse their contemplated assault." That very night, the army of Abdullah Khan was surprised by a torrential rain which overwhelmed that section which lay close to the fort. Much of the ammunition was irretrievably ruined. There gathered within the walls of the fort an amount of water which, for a long period, was sufficient for the consumption of the besieged. In the course of the following night, a snowfall, such as the people of the neighborhood, even in the depth of winter, had never experienced, added considerably to the annoyance which the rain had caused. The next night, which was the evening preceding the 5th of Muharram in the year AH 1265, the 1st of December AD 1848, Qurus determined to leave the gate of the fort. "Praise be to God," he remarked to Rasul-i-Bani Miri, as he paced with calm and serenity the approaches to the gate, "who has graciously answered our prayer and caused both rain and snow to fall upon our enemies, a fall that has brought desolation into their camp and refreshment into our fort." As the hour of the attack approached, for which that numerous army, despite the losses it had sustained, was strenuously preparing, Qurus determined to sally out and scatter its forces. 2 hours after sunrise he mounted his steed and, escorted by Mullah Hussein and 3 other of his companions, all of whom were riding beside him, marched out of the gate, followed by the entire company on foot behind them. As soon as they had emerged, there pealed out the cry of "Ya Sahibus Saman," a cry that diffused consternation through the camp of the enemy. The roar which these lion-hearted followers of the Bab raised amidst the forest of Mazindaran dispersed the affrighted enemy that lay in ambush within its recesses. The glitter of their bared weapons dazzled their sight, and its menace was sufficient to stun and overpower them. They fled in disgraceful rout before their onrush, leaving all possessions behind them. Within the space of 45 minutes, the shout of victory had been raised. Qurus and Mullah Hussein had succeeded in bringing under their control the remnants of the defeated army. Abdullah Khan-i-Turkaman, with 2 of his officers, Habibullah Khan-i-Afghan and Nurullah Khan-i-Afghan, together with no less than 430 of their men, had perished. Qurus returned to the fort, while Mullah Hussein was still engaged in pursuing the work which had been so valiantly performed. The voice of Syed Abdul Azim-i-Qui was soon raised, summoning him on behalf of Qurus to return immediately to the fort. "We have repulsed the assailants," Qurus remarked. "We need not carry further the punishment. Our purpose is to protect ourselves, that we may be able to continue our labors for the regeneration of men. We have no intention whatever of causing unnecessary harm to anyone. What we have already achieved is sufficient testimony to God's invincible power. We, a little band of his followers, have been able, through his sustaining grace, to overcome the organized and trained army of our enemies." Despite this defeat, not one of the followers of the Bab lost his life in the course of that encounter. No one except a man named Kuli, who rode in advance of Qurus, was badly wounded. They were all commanded to take none of the property of their adversaries excepting their swords and horses. As the signs of the reassembling of the forces which had been commanded by Abdullah Khan became apparent, Qurus bade his companions dig a moat around the fort as a safeguard against a renewed attack. 19 days elapsed, during which they exerted themselves to the utmost for the completion of the task they had been charged to perform. They joyously labored by day and by night in order to expedite the work with which they had been entrusted. Soon after the work was completed, it was announced that Prince Mehdi Quli Mirza was advancing towards the fort at the head of a numerous army, and had actually encamped at Shirgah. A few days later he had transferred his headquarters to Vaskas. On his arrival, he sent one of his men to inform Mullah Hussein that he had been commanded by the Shah to ascertain the purpose of his activities and to request that he be enlightened as to the object he had in view. "Tell your master," Mullah Hussein replied, "that we utterly disclaim any intention either of subverting the foundations of the monarchy or of usurping the authority of Nasir-ed-Din Shah. Our cause concerns the revelation of the promised Qaim and is primarily associated with the interests of the ecclesiastical order of this country. We can set forth incontrovertible arguments and deduce infallible proofs in support of the truth of the message we bear." The passionate sincerity with which Mullah Hussein pleaded in defense of his cause, and the details which he cited to demonstrate the validity of his claims, touched the heart of the messenger and brought tears to his eyes. "What are we to do?" he exclaimed. "Let the prince," Mullah Hussein replied, "direct the ulamas of both Sari and Bafurush to betake themselves to this place and ask us to demonstrate the validity of the revelation proclaimed by the Bab. Let the Koran decide as to who speaks the truth. Let the prince himself judge our case and pronounce the verdict. Let him also decide as to how he should treat us if we fail to establish, by the aid of verses and traditions, the truth of this cause." The messenger expressed his complete satisfaction with the answer he had received, and promised that before the lapse of 3 days the ecclesiastical dignitaries would be convened in the manner he had suggested. The promise given by the messenger was destined to remain unfulfilled. 3 days after, Prince Miti Kulit Mirza prepared to launch his attack, on a scale hitherto unprecedented, upon the occupants of the fort. At the head of 3 regiments of infantry and several regiments of cavalry, he quartered his host upon a height that overlooked that spot, and gave the signal to open fire in that direction. The day had not yet broken, when, at the signal, "Mount your steeds, O heroes of God!" Qudus ordered that the gates of the fort be again thrown open. Mullah Hussein and 202 of his companions ran to their horses and followed Qudus as he rode out in the direction of Vaskas. Undaunted by overwhelming forces arrayed against them, and undeterred by the snow and mud which had accumulated on the roads, they headed, without a pause, in the direction of the darkness that surrounded them, towards the stronghold which served as a base for the operations of the enemy. The prince, who was observing the movements of Mullah Hussein, saw him approaching from his fort, and ordered his men to open fire upon him. The bullets which they discharged were powerless to check his advance. He forced his way through the gate and rushed into the private apartments of the prince, who, with a sudden sense that his life was in danger, threw himself from a back window into the moat and escaped barefooted. His host, deprived of their leader and struck with panic, fled in disgraceful rout before that little band which, despite their own overwhelming numbers and the resources which the imperial treasury had placed at their disposal, they were unable to subdue. As the victors were forcing their way through the section of the fort reserved for the prince, 2 other princes of royal blood fell in an attempt to strike down their opponents. As they penetrated his apartments, they discovered, in one of his rooms, coffers filled with gold and silver, all of which they disdained to touch. With the exception of a pot of gunpowder and the favourite sword of the prince, which they carried as an evidence of their triumph to Mullah Hussein, his companions ignored the costly furnishings which their owner had abandoned in his despair. When they took it to Mullah Hussein, they discovered that he had, as a result of the bullet which had struck his own sword, exchanged it for that of Qudus, with which he was engaged in repulsing the assailant. They were throwing open the gate of the prison, which had been in the hands of the enemy, when they heard the voice of Mullah Yusuf-i-Ardibili, who had been made a captive on his way to the fort, and was languishing amongst the prisoners. He interceded for his fellow sufferers, and succeeded in obtaining their immediate release. On the morning of that memorable engagement, Mullah Hussein assembled his companions around Qudus in the outskirts of Vaskas, while he remained himself on horseback in anticipation of a renewed attack by the enemy. He was watching their movements when he suddenly observed an innumerable host rushing from both sides towards him. All sprang to their feet, and, raising the cry of "Ya Sahibuz Saman," pressed forward to face the challenge. Mullah Hussein spurred his charger in one direction, and Qudus and his companions in another. The detachment, which was charging Mullah Hussein, suddenly deflected its course, and, fleeing from before him, joined forces with the rest of the enemy, and encompassed Qudus and those who were with him. At a given moment they discharged 1,000 bullets, one of which struck Qudus in the mouth, knocking out several of his teeth and wounding both his tongue and his throat. The loud noise which the simultaneous discharge of 1,000 bullets produced, and which could be heard at a distance of 10 farsangs, filled with apprehension Mullah Hussein, who hastened to the rescue of his friends. As soon as he reached them, he alighted from his horse, and entrusting it to his attendant, Tamba Ali, ran towards Kurus. The sight of blood dripping profusely from the mouth of his beloved chief struck him with fear and dismay. He raised his hands in horror, and was on the point of beating himself upon the head when Kurus bade him desist. Obeying his leader instantly, he begged him to be allowed to receive his sword from his hand, which, as soon as it had been delivered, was unsheathed from its scabbard and used to scatter the forces that had massed around him. Followed by 110 of his fellow disciples, he faced the forces arrayed against him, wielding in one hand the sword of his beloved leader, and in the other that of his disgraced opponent. He fought a desperate battle against them, and within 30 minutes, during which he displayed marvelous heroism, he succeeded in putting the entire army to flight. The disgraceful retreat of the army of Prince Mehdi Kuli Mirza enabled Mullah Hussein and his companions to repair to the fort. With pain and regret, they conducted their wounded leader to the shelter of his stronghold. On his arrival, Kurus addressed a written appeal to his friends, who were bewailing his injury, and by his words of cheer soothed their sorrow. We should submit, he exhorted them, to whatever is the will of God. We should stand firm and steadfast in the hour of trial. The stone of the infidel broke the teeth of the prophet of God. Mine have fallen as a result of the bullet of the enemy. Though my body be afflicted, my soul is immersed in gladness. My gratitude to God knows no bounds. If you love me, suffer not that this joy be obscured by the sight of your lamentations. This memorable engagement fell on the 25th of Muharram, A.H. 1265, 21st of December, A.D. 1848. In the beginning of that same month, Baha'u'llah, faithful to the promise he had given to Mullah Hussein, set out, attended by a number of his friends, from Nur for the fort of Tabarsi. Among those who accompanied him were Haji Mirza Jani-i Kashani, Mullah Bakir-i Tabrizi, one of the Letters of the Living, and Mirza Yahya, his brother. Baha'u'llah had signified his wish that they should proceed directly to their destination and allow no pause in their journey. His intention was to reach that spot at night, inasmuch as strict orders had been issued ever since Abdullah Khan had assumed the command that no help should be extended under any circumstances to the occupants of the fort. Guards had been stationed at different places to ensure the isolation of the besieged. His companions, however, pressed him, Baha'u'llah, to interrupt the journey and to seek a few hours of rest. Although he knew that this delay would involve a grave risk of being surprised by the enemy, he yielded to their earnest request. They halted at a lonely house adjoining the road. After supper, his companions all retired to sleep. He alone, despite the hardships he had endured, remained wakeful. He knew well the perils to which he and his friends were exposed, and was fully aware of the possibilities which his early arrival at the fort involved. As he watched beside them, the secret emissaries of the enemy informed the guards of the neighborhood of the arrival of the party, and ordered the immediate seizure of whatever they could find in their possession. We have received strict orders, they told Baha'u'llah, whom they recognized instantly as the leader of the group, to arrest every person we chance to meet in this vicinity, and are commanded to conduct him without any previous investigation to Amul and deliver him into the hands of its governor. The matter has been misrepresented in your eyes, Baha'u'llah remarked. You have misconstrued our purpose. I would advise you to act in a manner that will cause you eventually no regret. This admonition, uttered with dignity and calm, induced the chief of the guards to treat with consideration and courtesy those whom he had arrested. He bade them mount their horses and proceed with him to Amul. As they were approaching the banks of a river, Baha'u'llah signaled to his companions, who were riding at a distance from the guards, to cast into the water whatever manuscripts they had in their possession. At daybreak, as they were approaching the town, a message was sent in advance to the acting governor, informing him of the arrival of a party that had been captured on their way to the fort of Tabarsi. The governor himself, together with the members of his bodyguard, had been appointed to join the army of Prince Mehdi Kuli Mirza, and had commissioned his kinsman to act in his absence. As soon as the message reached him, he went to the Masjid of Amul and summoned the ulamas and leading Sayyids of the town to gather and meet the party. He was greatly surprised as soon as his eyes saw and recognized Baha'u'llah, and deeply regretted the orders he had given. He feigned to reprimand him for the action he, Baha'u'llah, had taken in the hope of appeasing the tumult and allaying the excitement of those who had gathered in the Masjid. "We are innocent," Baha'u'llah declared, "of the guilt they impute to us. Our blamelessness will eventually be established in your eyes. I would advise you to act in a manner that will cause you eventually no regret." The acting governor asked the ulamas who were present to put any question they desired. To their inquiries, Baha'u'llah returned explicit and convincing replies. As they were interrogating him, they discovered a manuscript in possession of one of his companions, which they recognized as the writings of the Bab, and which they handed to the chief of the ulamas present at the gathering. As soon as he had perused a few lines of that manuscript, he laid it aside, and turning to those around him, exclaimed, "These people who advance such extravagant claims have, in this very sentence which I have read, betrayed their ignorance of the most rudimentary rules of orthography." "Esteemed and learned divine," Baha'u'llah replied, "these words which you criticize are not the words of the Bab. They have been uttered by no less a personage than the Imam Ali, the commander of the faithful, in his reply to Kumail ibn Ziyad, whom he had chosen as his companion." The circumstances which Baha'u'llah proceeded to relate in connection with the reply, no less than the manner of his delivery, convinced the arrogant mujtahid of his stupidity and blunder. Unable to contradict so weighty a statement, he preferred to keep silent. A Sayyid angrily interjected, "This very statement conclusively demonstrates that its author is himself a Babi, and no less than a leading expounder of the tenets of that sect." He urged in vehement language that its followers be put to death. "These obscure sectarians are the sworn enemies," he cried, "both of the state and of the faith of Islam. We must at all costs extirpate that heresy." He was seconded in his denunciation by the other Sayyids who were present, and who, emboldened by the imprecations uttered at that gathering, insisted that the governor comply unhesitatingly with their wishes. The acting governor was much embarrassed, and realized that any evidence of the indulgence on his part would be fraught with grave consequences for the safety of his position. In his desire to hold in check the passions which had been aroused, he ordered his attendants to prepare the rods and promptly inflict a befitting punishment upon the captives. "We will afterwards," he added, "keep them in prison pending the return of the governor, who will send them to Tehran, where they will receive at the hands of the sovereign the chastisement they deserve." The first who was bound to receive the bastinado was Mullah Bakir. "I am only a groom of Baha'u'llah," he urged. "I was on my way to Mashhad when they suddenly arrested me and brought me to this place." Baha'u'llah intervened and succeeded in inducing his oppressors to release him. He likewise interceded for Haji Mirza Jani, who, he said, was a mere tradesman, whom he regarded as his guest, so that he, Baha'u'llah, was responsible for any charge brought against him. Mirza Yahya, whom they proceeded to bind, was also set free as soon as Baha'u'llah had declared him to be his attendant. "None of these men," he told the acting governor, "are guilty of any crime. If you insist on inflicting your punishment, I offer myself as a willing victim of your chastisement." The acting governor was reluctantly compelled to give orders that Baha'u'llah alone be chosen to suffer the indignity which he had intended originally for his companions. The same treatment that had been meted out to the Bab 5 months previously in Tabriz, Baha'u'llah suffered in the presence of the assembled ulamas of Amul. The first confinement that the Bab suffered at the hands of his enemies was in the house of Abdul Hamid Khan, the chief constable of Shiraz. The first confinement of Baha'u'llah was in the home of one of the Kadqudas of Tehran. The Bab's second imprisonment was in the castle of Marku. That of Baha'u'llah was in the private residence of the governor of Amul. The Bab was scourged in the Namaz Khani of the Sheikhul Islam of Tabriz, the Namaz Khani, literally prayer house. The same indignity was inflicted on Baha'u'llah in the Namaz Khani of the Mujtahid of Amul. The Bab's third confinement was in the castle of Shirik. Baha'u'llah's was in the Sia Chal of Tehran. A footnote says literally Sia Chal means black pit, the subterranean dungeon in which Baha'u'llah was imprisoned. The Bab, whose trials and sufferings had preceded in almost every case those of Baha'u'llah, had offered himself to ransom his beloved from the perils that beset that precious life, while Baha'u'llah, on his part, unwilling that he who so greatly loved him should be the sole sufferer, shared at every turn the cup that had touched his lips. Such love no eye has ever beheld, nor has mortal heart conceived such mutual devotion. If the branches of every tree were turned into pens, and all the seas into ink, and earth and heaven rolled into one parchment, the immensity of that love would still remain unexplored, and the depths of that devotion unfathomed. Baha'u'llah and his companions remained for a time imprisoned in one of the rooms that formed part of the masjid. The acting governor, who was still determined to shield his prisoner from the assaults of an inveterate enemy, secretly instructed his attendants to open, at an unsuspected hour, a passage through the wall of the room in which the captives were confined, and to transfer their leader immediately to his home. He was himself conducting Baha'u'llah to his residence when a Sayyid sprang forward and, directing his fiercest invectives against him, Baha'u'llah, raised the club which he had held in his hand to strike him. The acting governor immediately interposed himself, and, appealing to the assailant, adjured him by the Prophet of God to stay his hand. "What?" burst forth the Sayyid. "How dare you release a man who was the sworn enemy of the faith of our fathers?" A crowd of ruffians had meanwhile gathered around him, and by their howls of derision and abuse added to the clamour which he had raised. Despite the growing tumult, the attendants of the acting governor were able to conduct Baha'u'llah in safety to the residence of their master, and displayed on that occasion a courage and presence of mind that were truly surprising. Despite the protestations of the mob, the rest of the prisoners were taken to the seat of government, and thus escaped from the perils with which they had been threatened. The acting governor offered profuse apologies to Baha'u'llah for the treatment which the people of Amul had accorded him. But for the interposition of Providence, he said, no force would have achieved your deliverance from the grasp of this malevolent people. But for the efficacy of the vow which I had made to risk my own life for your sake, I too would have fallen a victim to their violence, and would have been trampled beneath their feet. He bitterly complained of the outrageous conduct of the Sayyids of Amul, and denounced the baseness of their character. He expressed himself as being continually tormented by the effects of their malignant designs. He set about serving Baha'u'llah with devotion and kindness, and was often heard in the course of his conversation with him to remark, "I am far from regarding you as a prisoner in my home. This house, I believe, was built for the very purpose of affording you a shelter from the designs of your foes." I have heard Baha'u'llah himself recount the following. "No prisoner has ever been accorded the treatment which I received at the hands of the acting governor of Amul. He treated me with the utmost consideration and esteem. I was generously entertained by him, and the fullest attention was given to everything that affected my security and comfort. I was, however, unable to leave the gate of the house. My host was afraid lest the governor, who was related to Abbas Kulikani Larijani, might return from the fort of Tabasi and inflict injury upon me. I tried to dispel his apprehensions. The same omnipotence, I assured him, who has delivered us from the hands of the mischief-makers of Amul, and has enabled us to be received with such hospitality by you in this house, is able to change the heart of the governor, and cause him to treat us with no less consideration and love." One night we were suddenly awakened by the clamour of the people who had gathered outside the gate of the house. The door was opened, and it was announced that the governor had returned to Amul. Our companions, who were anticipating a fresh attack upon them, were completely surprised to hear the voice of the governor rebuking those who had denounced us so bitterly on the day of our arrival. "For what reason," we heard him loudly remonstrating, "have these miserable wretches chosen to treat so disrespectfully a guest whose hands are tied and who has not been given the chance to defend himself? What is their justification for having demanded that he be immediately put to death? What evidence have they with which to support their contention? If they be sincere in their claims to be devoutly attached to Islam and to be the guardians of its interests, let them betake themselves to the fort of Sheikh Tabasi, and there demonstrate their capacity to defend the faith of which they profess to be the champions." What he had seen of the heroism of the defenders of the fort had quite changed the mind and heart of the governor of Amul. He returned filled with admiration for a cause which he had formerly despised, and the progress of which he had strenuously resisted. The scenes he witnessed had disarmed his wrath and chastened his pride. Humbly and respectfully he went to Baha'u'llah and apologized for the insolence of the inhabitants of a town that he had been chosen to govern. He served him with extreme devotion, utterly ignoring his own position and rank. He paid a glowing tribute to Mullah Hussein, and expatiated upon his resourcefulness, his intrepidity, his skill and nobleness of soul. A few days later he succeeded in arranging for the safe departure of Baha'u'llah and his companions for Tehran. Baha'u'llah's intention to throw in his lot with the defenders of the fort of Sheikh Tabasi was destined to remain unfulfilled. Though himself extremely desirous to lend every possible assistance in his power to the besieged, he was spared, through the mysterious dispensation of Providence, the tragic fate that was soon to befall the chief participators in that memorable struggle. Had he been able to reach the fort, had he been allowed to join the members of that heroic band, how could he have played his part in the great drama which he was destined to unfold? How could he have consummated the work that had been so gloriously conceived and so marvelously inaugurated? He was in the heyday of his life when the call from Shiraz reached him. At the age of 27, he arose to consecrate his life to its service, fearlessly identified himself with its teachings, and distinguished himself by the exemplary part he played in its diffusion. No effort was too great for the energy with which he was endowed, and no sacrifice too woeful for the devotion with which his faith had inspired him. He flung aside every consideration of fame, of wealth and position, for the prosecution of the task he had set his heart to achieve. Neither the taunts of his friends nor the threats of his enemies could induce him to cease championing a cause which they alike regarded as that of an obscure and proscribed sect. The first incarceration to which he was subjected as a result of the helping hand he had extended to the captives of Qazvin, the ability with which he achieved the deliverance of Tahiri, the exemplary manner in which he steered the course of the turbulent proceedings in Badasht, the manner in which he saved the life of Qudus in Niyala, the wisdom which he showed in his handling of the delicate situation created by the impetuosity of Tahiri, and the vigilance he exercised for her protection, the counsels which he gave to the defenders of the fort of Tabasi, the plan he conceived of joining the forces of Qudus to those of Mullah Hussein and his companions, the spontaneity with which he arose to support the exertions of those brave defenders, the magnanimity which prompted him to offer himself as a substitute for his companions who were under the threat of severe indignities, the serenity with which he faced the severity inflicted upon him as a result of the attempt on the life of Nasir-ed-Din Shah, the indignities which were heaped upon him all the way from Lavasan to the headquarters of the imperial army, and from thence to the capital, the galling weight of chains which he bore as he lay in the darkness of the Siachal in Tehran. All these were but a few instances that eloquently testify to the unique position which he occupied as the prime mover of the forces which were destined to reshape the face of his native land. It was he who had released these forces, who steered their course, harmonized their action, and brought them finally to their highest consummation in the cause he himself was destined at a later time to reveal. Chapter 20. The Mazindaran Upheaval, Part 2. The forces under the command of Prince Mehdi Kuli Mirza meanwhile had recovered from the state of utter demoralization into which they had sunk, and were now diligently preparing to renew their attack upon the occupants of the fort of Tabasi. The latter found themselves again encompassed by a numerous host, at the head of which marched Abbas Kuli Khan-i Larijani and Suleiman Khan-i Afshar-i Shariari, who, together with several regiments of infantry and cavalry, had hastened to reinforce the company of the prince's soldiers. Their combined forces encamped in the neighborhood of the fort and proceeded to erect a series of 7 barricades around it. With the utmost arrogance, they sought at first to display the extent of the forces at their command, and indulged with increasing zest in the daily exercise of their arms. The scarcity of water had, in the meantime, compelled those who were besieged to dig a well within the enclosure of the fort. On the day the work was to be completed, the 8th day of the month of Rabiul Awwal, the 1st of February, AD 1849, Mullah Hussein, who was watching his companions perform this task, remarked, "Today we shall have all the water we require for our bath. Cleansed of all earthly defilements, we shall seek the court of the Almighty, and shall hasten to our eternal abode. Whoso is willing to partake of the cup of martyrdom, let him prepare himself and wait for the hour when he can seal with his life-blood his faith in his cause. This night, ere the hour of dawn, let those who wish to join me be ready to issue forth from behind these walls, and, scattering once again the dark forces which have beset our path, ascend untrammeled to the heights of glory." That same afternoon, Mullah Hussein performed his ablutions, clothed himself in new garments, attired his head with a barb's turban, and prepared for the approaching encounter. An undefinable joy illumined his face. He serenely alluded to the hour of his departure, and continued to his last moments to animate the zeal of his companions. Alone with Qudus, who so powerfully reminded him of his beloved, he poured forth, as he sat at his feet, in the closing moments of his earthly life, all that an enraptured soul could no longer restrain. Soon after midnight, as soon as the morning star had risen, a star that heralded to him the dawning light of eternal reunion with his beloved, he started to his feet, and, mounting his charger, gave the signal that the gate of the fort be opened. As he rode out at the head of 313 of his companions to meet the enemy, the cry of "Ya Sahibus Saman" again broke forth, a cry so intense and powerful that forest, fort, and camp vibrated to its resounding echo. Mullah Hussein first charged the barricade, which was defended by Zakariya-i-Qadi Kalai, one of the enemy's most valiant officers. Within a short space of time he had broken through that barrier, disposed of its commander, and scattered his men. Dashing forward with the same swiftness and intrepidity, he overcame the resistance of both the second and third barricades, diffusing as he advanced despair and consternation among his foes. Undeterred by the bullets which rained continually upon him and his companions, they pressed forward until the remaining barricades had all been captured and overthrown. In the midst of the tumult which ensued, Abbas Quli Khan Ilarijani had climbed a tree and, hiding himself in its branches, lay waiting in ambush for his opponents. Protected by the darkness which surrounded him, he was able to follow from his hiding place the movements of Mullah Hussein and his companions, who were exposed to the fierce glare of the conflagration which they had raised. The steed of Mullah Hussein suddenly became entangled in the rope of an adjoining tent, and ere he was able to extricate himself, he was struck in the breast by a bullet from his treacherous assailant. Though the shot was successful, Abbas Quli Khan was unaware of the identity of the horseman he had wounded. Mullah Hussein, who was bleeding profusely, dismounted from his horse, staggered a few steps, and, unable to proceed further, fell exhausted upon the ground. Two of his young companions, of Khorasan, Quli, and Hassan, came to his rescue and bore him to the fort. I have heard the following account from Mullah Sadiq and Mullah Mirza Muhammadi Farooqi. We were among those who had remained in the fort with Qudus. As soon as Mullah Hussein, who seemed to have lost consciousness, was brought in, we were ordered to retire. "Leave me alone with him," were the words of Qudus, as he bade Mirza Muhammad Baqir close the door and refuse admittance to anyone desiring to see him. "There are certain confidential matters which I desire him alone to know." We were amazed a few minutes later when we heard the voice of Mullah Hussein replying to questions from Qudus. For 2 hours they continued to converse with each other. We were surprised to see Mirza Muhammad Baqir so greatly agitated. "I was watching Qudus," he subsequently informed us, "through a fissure in the door. As soon as he called his name, I saw Mullah Hussein arise and seat himself in his customary manner on bended knees beside him. With bowed head and downcast eyes, he listened to every word that fell from the lips of Qudus and answered his questions. 'You have hastened the hour of your departure,' I was able to hear Qudus remark, 'and have abandoned me to the mercy of my foes. Please God, I will ere long join you and taste the sweetness of heaven's ineffable delights.' I was able to gather the following words uttered by Mullah Hussein: 'May my life be a ransom for you. Are you well pleased with me?' A long time elapsed before Qudus bade Mirza Muhammad Baqir to open the door and admit his companions. "I have bade my last farewell to him," he said as we entered the room. "Things which previously I deemed it unallowable to utter I have now shared with him." We found on our arrival that Mullah Hussein had expired. A faint smile still lingered upon his face. Such was the peacefulness of his countenance that he seemed to have fallen asleep. Qudus attended to his burial, clothed him in his own shirt, and gave instructions to lay him to rest to the south of it, and adjoining the shrine of Sheikh Tabasi. "Well is it with you to have remained to your last hour faithful to the covenant of God," he said as he laid a parting kiss upon his eyes and forehead. "I pray God to grant that no division ever be caused between you and me." He spoke with such poignancy that the 7 companions who were standing beside him wept profusely and wished they had been sacrificed in his stead. Qudus, with his own hands, laid the body in the tomb and cautioned those who were standing near him to maintain secrecy regarding the spot which served as his resting place, and to conceal it even from their companions. He afterwards instructed them to inter the bodies of the 36 martyrs who had fallen in the course of that engagement in one and the same grave on the northern side of the shrine of Sheikh Tabasi. "Let the loved ones of God," he was heard to remark as he consigned them to their tomb, "take heed of the example of these martyrs of our faith. Let them in life be and remain as united as these are now in death." No less than 90 of the companions were wounded that night, most of whom succumbed. From the day of their arrival at Barfa Rush to the day they were first attacked, which fell on the 12th of Dhul Qadi in the year AH 1264, the 10th of October AD 1848, to the day of the death of Mullah Hussein, which took place at the hour of dawn on the 9th of Rabiul Awwal in the year AH 1265, the 2nd of February AD 1849, the number of martyrs, according to the computation of Mirza Muhammad Baqir, had reached a total of 72. From the time when Mullah Hussein was assailed by his enemies to the time of his martyrdom was 116 days, a period rendered memorable by deeds so heroic that even his bitterest foes felt bound to confess their wonder. On 4 distinct occasions he rose to such heights of courage and power as few indeed could attain. The first encounter took place on the 12th of Dhul Qadi, the 10th of October, AD 1848, in the outskirts of Bafarush, the second in the immediate neighborhood of the fort of Sheikh Tabasi, on the 5th day of the month of Muharram, the 1st of December, AD 1848, against the forces of Abdullah Khan-i Turkaman. The third in Vaskaz, on the 25th day of Muharram, the 21st of December, AD 1848, and was directed against the army of Prince Mihdi Quli Mirza. The last and most memorable battle of all was directed against the combined forces of Abbas Quli Khan, of Prince Mihdi Quli Mirza, and of Suleiman Khan-i Afshar, assisted by a company of 45 officers of tried ability and mature experience. From each of these hot and fierce engagements, Mullah Hussein emerged, in spite of the overwhelming forces arrayed against him, unscathed and triumphant. In each encounter he distinguished himself by such acts of valor, of chivalry, of skill, and of strength that each one alone would suffice to establish for all time the transcendent character of a faith for the protection of which he had so valiantly fought, and in the path of which he had so nobly died. The traits of mind and of character which from his very youth he displayed, the profundity of his learning, the tenacity of his faith, his intrepid courage, his singleness of purpose, his high sense of justice and unswerving devotion, marked him as an outstanding figure among those who, by their lives, have borne witness to the glory and power of the new revelation. He was 36 years old when he quaffed the cup of martyrdom. At the age of 18, he had made the acquaintance in Karbala of Sayyid Qazim Rashdi. For 9 years he sat at his feet and imbibed the lesson which was destined to prepare him for the acceptance of the message of the Bab. The 9 remaining years of his life were spent in the midst of a restless, feverish activity which carried him eventually to the field of martyrdom, in circumstances that have shed imperishable luster upon his country's history. So complete and humiliating a rout paralyzed for a time the efforts of the enemy. 45 days passed before they could again reassemble their forces and renew their attack. During these intervening days, which ended with the day of Nauruz, the intense cold which prevailed induced them to defer their venture against an opponent that had covered them with so much reproach and shame. Though their attacks had been suspended, the officers in charge of the remnants of the imperial army had given strict orders prohibiting the arrival of all manner of reinforcements at the fort. When the supply of their provisions was nearly exhausted, Qudus instructed Mirza Muhammad Baqir to distribute among his companions the rice which Mullah Hussein had stored for such time as might be required. When each had received his portion, Qudus summoned them and said, "Whoever feels himself strong enough to withstand the calamities that are soon to befall us, let him remain with us in this fort. And whoever perceives in himself the least hesitation and fear, let him betake himself away from this place. Let him leave immediately ere the enemy has again assembled his forces and assailed us. The way will soon be barred before our face. We shall very soon encounter the severest hardship and fall a victim to devastating afflictions." The very night Qudus had given this warning, a seer from Qum, Mirza Hussein-i Mutawali, was moved to betray his companions. "Why is it," he wrote to Abbas Quli Khan-i Larijani, "that you have left unfinished the work which you have begun? You have already disposed of a formidable opponent. By the removal of Mullah Hussein, who was the moving force behind these walls, you have demolished the pillar on which the strength and security of the fort depend. Had you been patient for one more day, you would have assuredly won for yourself the laurels of victory. With no more than 100 men, I pledge my word that within the space of 2 days you will be able to capture the fort and secure the unconditional surrender of its occupants. They are worn with famine and are being grievously tested." The sealed letter was entrusted to a certain Syed Ali-i Zargar, who, as he carried with him the share of the rice he had received from Qudus, stole out of the fort at the hour of midnight and delivered it to Abbas Quli Khan, with whom he was already acquainted. The message reached him at a time when he had sought refuge in a village situated at a distance of 4 farsangs from the fort, and knew not whether he should return to the capital and present himself after such a humiliating defeat to his sovereign, or repair to his home in Larijan, where he was sure to face the reproaches of his relations and friends. He had just risen from his bed when, at the hour of sunrise, the Syed brought him the letter. The news of the death of Mullah Hussein nerved him to a fresh resolve. Fearing lest the messenger should spread the report concerning the death of so redoubtable an opponent, he instantly killed him, and then contrived by some strange device to divert from himself the suspicion of murder. Resolved to take the fullest advantage of the distress of the besieged and of the depletion of their forces, he undertook immediately the necessary preparations for the resumption of his attacks. 10 days before Nauruz, he had encamped at half a farsang from the fort, and had ascertained the accuracy of the message that treacherous Syed had brought him. In the hope of obtaining for himself every possible credit for the eventual surrender of his opponents, he refused to divulge to even his closest officers the information he had received. The day had just broken when he hoisted his standard and, marching at the head of 2 regiments of infantry and cavalry, encompassed the fort and ordered his men to open fire upon the sentinels who were guarding the turrets. The betrayer, Qudus informed Mirza Muhammad Baqir, who had hastened to acquaint him with the gravity of the situation, has announced the death of Mullah Hussein to Abbas Quli Khan. Emboldened by his removal, he is now determined to storm our stronghold and to secure for himself the honor of being its sole conqueror. Sally out and, with the aid of 18 men marching at your side, administer a befitting chastisement upon the aggressor and his host. Let him realize that though Mullah Hussein be no more, God's invincible power still continues to sustain his companions and enable them to triumph over the forces of their enemies.